Welcome to the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. I'm Nancy Bosker, our director. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nancy Baker-Jones as our guest. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of Texas becoming the 9th state in the country and the first state in the South to pass women's right to vote. The anniversary was June 28, 1919. Dr. Jones, thank you for joining us and coming to our first birthday party today.
I'm happy to be here.
As we've discussed, Texas Women's University really played a pivotal role in really making sure women had rights, finally had power, and part of that was with the opening of our university in 1901. Tell us a little bit about the women who were involved in that.
Well, there were a lot of women involved in making sure that TWU became a reality. First of all, there were women who lobbied for it, who lobbied the legislature for it, members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Texas Federation of Women's Clubs and the Grange and organizations like that. So there were a lot of women who understood that education for women was extremely important. In addition to that, there were 3 women who were quite prominent in society in different cities in Texas who became members of the Board of Regents, and they were the first 3 women to be regents in the state of Texas. One of those was Helen Stoddard, who was head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union for 16 years. And she was also a supporter of many causes for the advancement of women's rights. There was another woman named Lizzie Birdie Johnson, who was also a suffragist, as was Helen Stoddard. And then there was a third woman named Eleanor Brackenridge, who was from San Antonio, who was a club woman. And she was the 3rd member of the Board of Regents. And she was a woman who had already been president of the Texas Equal Suffrage Association statewide. So all 3 of them had wonderful credentials in suffrage and in fostering women's education and in working for women's equal access to health, education, and welfare.
One of the stories you told today at lunch was that when women came here to go to school, they were focusing on home ec, nursing, but part of their mission when they would go out to rural Texas was to teach health, but to also put that dose of women getting to vote. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there was a program that was called the Home Demonstration Program, and this was an opportunity for universities like TWU and others, because Texas was such a rural state at this time, and a lot of women were not educated and didn't have access to the latest information. So home demonstration faculty and workers would go out to women in rural areas, and they would teach them the latest information about how to raise children and how to cook healthy meals and how to keep their homes clean and stay healthy and so forth. And every once in a while it became an opportunity for some of those people who knew something about the importance of women's suffrage to sort of slip that into the lessons that they were teaching. And so this became a very subtle but significant avenue to spread the word about how important it was for women to vote.
We also learned a lot about how the railroads was really the first social media, especially to get the message across to women about suffrage. Tell us a little bit about Minnie Fisher Cunningham, her role in the trains and getting to places that have never really knew, as you said, did not know that this was an option.
Yeah, well, we have to go back in time and remember that there weren't highways, that people lived in what were called island communities, and they were separated from each other. They were self-sufficient. And so when the railroads came along in the 1870s and 80s, suddenly there was this massive transportation system that would allow people to go to small towns. People from big towns come to small towns and vice versa. So suffragists took advantage of that. And there was a woman named Marianna Folsom who may have visited as many as 40 or 50 different towns that way over the course of her time in Texas. So another of the suffragists that we know about who used the train system was Minnie Fisher Cunningham. And she was the head of the Texas Equal Suffrage Association beginning in 1915. She was a political genius, you might say, and so she understood the importance of getting out beyond Austin or Galveston, where she was from, and getting to know women in small towns. She used her own money. She used her own map of railway stations. She would find where there were suffrage clubs, mostly in East Texas and Central Texas, and she would simply go out there and she would start talking to people. Or she would have meetings organized with the local suffrage clubs so that they could strategize and figure out what the best way was to get pamphlets out or to have people sign suffrage petitions, that kind of thing. She wrote many letters back to her friends in Austin about how lonely it was and how frightened she sometimes was about being by herself and not knowing the people that she was going to meet, and then finding that there were wonderful people who were very interested in what she had to talk about. So she was courageous at a time when she didn't have a lot of resources. She went ahead and did it anyway.
Good advice for all women.
Yes.
So ever since our country was founded, you know, it was always difficult because it was so male dominated. And we have Abigail Adams that first said, remember the ladies, and of course, no one did. So it took a long time to actually have the word sex in an amendment to the Constitution. We know there was quite a controversy between what kinds of people could vote. So a lot of the early suffrages really were focused on white educated women. Tell us a little bit about women of color, other folks, and what they did to try to get a seat at the table.
We have to remember the context of the times when the suffrage amendment was passed, that we lived in a largely segregated South, and certainly that was true in Texas. And so the political system was also segregated, and only white people were allowed to vote in the primaries, which was the main election for everyone to vote in because we were a one-party state. So unfortunately, the natural result of that was that there were women of color who were not allowed to vote, and though they were very interested in suffrage, they formed their own suffrage clubs because the society was so segregated. They did that anyway. A lot of African American women did. Certainly in Austin, Galveston, and El Paso, there were very active African American clubs. But they also were active in their own chapters of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And so they had kind of a two-pronged approach to winning suffrage and to winning civil rights because it was so dangerous to be African American at that time, physically dangerous in a segregated society. They often were concerned not only about women having the right to vote, but also making sure that they could avoid the Klan and avoid the violence that came along with segregation. So the NAACP became sort of the second prong as an organization that these women formed and became members of, to take legal action when they found that they were being discriminated against, when they were prevented from registering or prevented from voting. They would then file suit against a number of counties or cities or institutions in the state, and it was those suits that one after another, decade after decade, finally found some resolution. In fact, the white primary was one of those things that African American women fought against, and men of course, that was finally resolved in 1944 when the white primary was finally declared illegal. So women of color were not ignorant that the suffrage movement was going on. It was also true of many Mexican American women who also had lives that were much more often concerned with survival issues than some Anglo women were, who had more education perhaps and higher income levels. But Mexican American women would get together in groups that they called mutualistas, in which they helped each other to get through the challenges of daily life and also to educate each other about the kind of social and political issues that were going on. And one of those women was named Jovita Idar. She and her family were very interested in suffrage, and they also had newspapers. And so they would write editorials, and they would make sure that people found out what was going on and educate their own communities that way.
So as we say that we are celebrating the day of June 28, 1919, I think the better term that you and I have discussed is no, we're commemorating it, because this is still a work in progress.
Yes.
All women did not get to vote that day.
That's
and so
correct.
you've told us about what happened then in 1944, but it was really the Voting Rights Act then in the 1965 that finally made it easier, or made it a law that women could vote across the board.
Yeah, what happened was that the power over who was allowed to vote resided in the states after Reconstruction. After the Civil War was over and after Reconstruction was over, the states got a Supreme Court declaration that they were in charge of who got to vote. And in segregated states, that meant that only white people would vote. So it really took the modern day civil rights movement in the 1960s throughout the South, with organizations like the NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. and all kinds of people who worked on in the civil rights movement, to convince, in this case, the president was Lyndon B. Johnson, who had taken office after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and he had made it his program to put into practice the things that Kennedy had wanted to see done that he couldn't because he had been murdered. And one of those was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which granted at the federal level civil rights to African Americans. And the other was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which took away from the states the power over elections and who could vote, and put that in the hands of the federal government instead. And so that made it a nationwide blanket assertion that the states would decide who had the right to vote, and if there were states who were discriminating against some citizens of those states, then they had to prove themselves to the federal government that they were no longer doing that before they could be allowed to hold elections.
If you had wisdom, just advice to give to our students here at Texas Women's University, as well as other people who are visiting, what would you tell a young woman today about her right to vote?
Oh my. There have been so many people who have died, who have fought and have bled and have died for the right to vote. And unless we know our own history, as the saying goes, we'll be doomed to repeat it. So it's really essential for women in particular, because there are so many ways in which women are discriminated against in ordinary laws and in the ordinary way that life presents itself, that in order to vote is a precious right, and it is a way for women in particular to have a voice in what happens around them, in the laws that are passed, the people who pass those laws, in every aspect of life. It's one of the most important rights that women have. And if we don't use it, then it's possible that we can't complain.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.